Okay. I think I got it.
Yeah.
All right. So, this is Jordan Ehlers interviewing Rod Kirchoff in Deschler, Nebraska on Sunday, November 20th at 11:44 a.m. Okay, and the first question is, when and where were you born?
Byron, Nebraska, Thayer County. And September 26, 1943.
Okay. What were your parents' names?
Arthur, John, and Lily Ann Kirchoff. And by the way, you enunciated Kirchoff exactly right.
Did I? Good.
Way to go, George. That's not done very often.
Where did you grow up?
In the Byron, Nebraska rural area of Thayer County. Farming community.
Okay.
About 150, 175 people probably.
Did you have any siblings?
Yes, I had 3 sisters and 2 older and 1 younger, and then a younger brother.
And how would you describe your childhood?
Oh, it was wonderful. We lived on a farm. Although we didn't realize it, we probably weren't the wealthiest people in the world, but we had a great childhood. Grew up in a Christian household and lived the life of farm kids. You know, we had our chores to do, our pets. Had a horse and a colt and lots of chickens. You know, it was fun. Barefooted around the place in the summertime. You had to watch where you stepped, of course, with free-range chickens. But it was great. Loved it. The family was wonderful. You know, we were a close family. Grew up with a lot of love and care. And I mean, it was really a close-knit family.
Great, that's great. Who was the most influential person to you as a child?
Oh, gee, there were lots. Of course, my father, but I really had 2 cousins, boys, and their father, Martin Kirchoff. They lived in Superior, and
So that would be your uncle?
Yes, my uncle, Martin. They called him Sparky. That was his nickname. I think following World War II, and he was a World War II veteran. And I think a lot of people at that time had nicknames. And of course, you know, it goes without saying that was passed on to a generation or 2 also. So, yeah. I think back about living in a small community, and maybe that's part of your follow-up here, I don't know. But if you want to go into that later, that's fine.
Yeah. And your socioeconomic class, you said that your family belonged to was lower.
Oh, yeah. On farming, there were wealthier farmers in the area than my parents, but we always seemed to have everything we needed. You know, we didn't realize maybe how poor we were. You know, it just never, as kids, we didn't associate that. We had things to eat, we had clothing to wear, and so we didn't see ourselves as poor.
And when you're happy, I don't think you notice that. Yeah.
And we were taught good work ethics, duties to do around the place, and of course to do our homework. That was always, we didn't have distractions in the home, no TVs. Actually, we grew up at the time, I remember when rural electrification became a reality, and they came around and set electric poles, and wow, we went from kerosene lamps on the wall, honestly, to electric lights, and that was just, that was unbelievable.
Oh, I bet that was cool.
It was, because we'd sit around, and then my grandfather, on my mother's father, he was the lone remaining grandfather or grandparent that I had, and he would come to visit in the evenings, and we'd always sit down, and of course he was good at checkers, and I became pretty proficient at playing checkers too. Card games in the evening, if you had your homework done, that always came first, but we always enjoyed family life with reading books and playing board games, Monopoly, things like that. My sisters were always indulging in paper dolls. I don't know where I'm going with that, but
Yeah, no, it's fine, it's
it's
fine.
just part of family life that
Yeah.
I grew up accustomed to, and there's things that I remember. Yeah, they'd have the little tabs they'd fold over to hold the new dress onto the little.
I had those.
Yeah.
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 They were so cool.
It was fun.
Where did you attend school or high school?
Attended, actually, before we lived in Byron, for 2 years, we lived in Red Cloud, Nebraska.
Oh, okay.
And my father ran a mechanic shop there, and he hired a couple of men to work with him. And then the farming operation became available because one of his brothers, the farm ground that he was leasing, became available because my Uncle Edgar, Dad's younger brother, who was farming it, he moved to north of Ehlers. So that farm ground around the Byron community and literally surrounding the Byron community in Nebraska became available. There were 500 some acres. So in those days, back in the 50s, early 50s, that was a significant farming operation. Today, it wouldn't cut the mustard. You'd need a couple thousand or more. But back then, with two-row equipment and just coming out of the use of horses, 20 years before that, 500 some acres, plus he had a quarter of ground of his own, so west of town. But in Nebraska, we farmed just around the community of Byron.
Okay.
And what was the question again?
Where did you attend high school?
Oh, I went to Red Cloud for 2 years, and we didn't have preschool, but I went to Red Cloud kindergarten and first grade. And Mrs. Hall was my kindergarten teacher. I still remember her. Told you I had long-term memory. But had 43 or 44 classmates. And so it was, I remember I had like 5 girlfriends.
Oh, good, good.
Carried books home for 2 of them. But then we moved to Byron, and I enrolled in Byron Public School District 68, I believe it was. And it was right there in town. Of course, at that time, in the early 50s, you still had a lot of your country schools in operation. And they consolidated. I was the only one in my class from 2nd grade through 8th grade.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. I was younger than a lot of them. I was the only student in the class. So the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade teacher moved me up with the class ahead of me. And I did all right. And so I was advanced. I was young for my class. I was the youngest one. But I did pretty good. I guess I was intellectually smart enough to carry the ball. And remained that way through the 8th grade. And then they consolidated all the country schools at that time. And so all of a sudden, I went into high school with 5 other classmates, and I just couldn't believe it,
Mm-hmm.
They moved me. I didn't continue with those who were a year older than I. But that time, so I still graduated when I was 17 years old. And we had classroom settings of probably 20 in each class, or maybe 30 in each classroom when I was in grade school.
Mm-hmm.
But then when in high school, at Byron, because of the low students numbers, especially my class, they moved classes together. So like the freshmen would sit in with the sophomores on a lot of the classes, and it worked out. I felt pretty well educated for a small school. One thing about it, you had more teacher one-on-one. I mean, you got all the attention that you really cared to have, and maybe more.
Yeah, probably more than you ever wanted. Yeah.
Yeah, but there was always good attendance as to what we were learning and how we were advancing. It was just, it was good education. I have no problem with it. Far better, I think, than what we're seeing today.
Mm-hmm. When did you, or how and where did you meet your wife?
Oh, that was kind of I had a date with a girl from Hebron,
Mm-hmm.
and was at their prom. And this is really kind of a unique story. I don't know how far I want to go into that, but yeah, I saw her at the prom, and I wasn't going real strong with this other gal. She was a nice little young lady, but I had no real close affection with her, and saw my wife Catherine at the prom at the dance, and I was too shy to go out over and make comment, but the girl that I was dating, her father was very strict. They wanted to toe the line. Mm-hmm. So at 12 o'clock, I had to take my date home, and she was a nice gal, and I appreciated her. And so I dropped her off at her house and walked her to the door and told her good night. And I got in my car. Well, I had 20 miles to go home, and it was cold. And I thought, I better not take a chance. So I stopped and got some gas before I left Hebron, which was 25 miles down the road to home. And when I did, here was my wife, or future wife, standing alongside of a car, and her date had somehow, in a short, brief time, had become fairly incapacitated. And I saw that, and I thought, wow, that's the gal that I saw at the prom, at the dance. And so I asked if there was a problem, if she would need some help. And she said yes. She didn't know what to do. He had passed out in the back seat of the car in the parking lot, and so and she seemed fairly sober. So I said, well, do you know where he lives? And she said yes, she did. And I had gassed up, fueled up the car by that time, and I said, so tell you what, you drive his car home and I'll pick you up and bring you back. That was that's how it happened. And on the way home we were talking, and wow, it must have been 3 o'clock in the morning by the time we finally said our goodbyes in her dad's front driveway, and he was still sitting up reading. He was an avid reader, and so I didn't want to waylay it too much, so I said we better say goodbye, but I'd like to see you again, and that's how it started. It was kind of a happenstance thing but the attraction was there. It just hadn't developed yet, but that was the way it actually happened.
That's a really nice story.
Yeah.
And then when did you get married?
We got married on, boy, you're really hitting some heavy hitters here.
Yeah.
June the 3rd, 1967.
Okay. And then do you have any children, and when were they born?
Yes, we have 3 children, and Andrew is the oldest. He was born in 1968. Thane, there was a little gap there because of my service time, and
So you had Andrew before you were in the service,
mm-hmm,
okay?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to go on with the question about our children and their ages first, but there was a little gap, and Thane was born March 14th, 1971, and Camille was born June the 3rd, 1975. And we kind of thought that was a neat plan, to have them about every 4 years, so that when they came college age, the burden for tuition and things wouldn't be quite so much. Best laid plans of mice and men don't always go that way, though. Because my wife went back to school at Hastings College. In the time when Thane was in college, she started to go to college. Well, she went to Fairbury first, and then they closed that college down. So then she began a commute of 75 miles a day from Deschler to Hastings and back, 150 miles round trip every day. So wore out a car or two, but I think I'm getting ahead of where we need to be.
Oh, that's okay.
Yeah,
that's totally
I really
fine.
am.
And then what careers have you had?
Following high school at Byron, I attended, wanted to go into architectural design and drafting or something along those lines. But at that time, as I said before, with siblings surrounding me, and the farming operation. It was a lease deal, and the owners sold the ground, and my father couldn't afford to buy it. There were reasons for that too, but anyway, I opted to go instead of to a 4-year because of financial shortages. And I probably could have went and worked my way through, but I chose to go to Milford Tech School. It was called the Nebraska Vocational Technical School at the time, and I went into auto collision repair. They had a start of a drafting class there the following year, the way I still remember. But at the time that I enrolled, it didn't. So I went into auto collision repair, and if you want me to follow that up with how I worked then for 2 years in Geneva, and I began dating about that time Kathy. And so when we got married, then, I had worked, I had this military obligation to fulfill. Back in those days, they still had the draft. Mm-hmm. And so I knew that was hanging over my head. And basically, when I got out of Milford 2 years later, I had already, after high school, we had to register. And so I knew that I needed to do something to fulfill that obligation. So I enrolled at that time. I left Geneva and was working back in Byron. A friend of mine had begun a shop and he hired me. So we were close down in this area again. That's when I met my wife at that time. So then I enrolled in the Kansas National Guard at Belleville. And there were quite a few guys from Third County at that time who crossed the state line and enlisted there. I think the reason is because we knew if we enlisted in the reserves or the National Guard, they sent you for specified training. Mm-hmm. And so they were an ordnance company, which was very in line with my abilities of mechanics, and ordnance doesn't mean bombs and guns, and it means in military terms or in Army terms, it was maintenance of equipment. So I became a mechanic. I was sent to Fort Leonard Wood for basic training, and 6 months. And when I went through basic training, the first eight weeks, the school that I was enrolled in at Aberdeen, Maryland, for collision repair of Army vehicles, which I thought was going to be great, that class was filled. They had no openings. So there I sat at Fort Leonard Wood, and for 2 weeks, not understanding that, hey, this is serious stuff here. Better get on the ball and get moving, or you'll. And my first sergeant, my platoon sergeant, came to me, and he told me, he says, "Rod," he says, "do you understand that your remaining here doing nothing is not going to advance you through your training process?" And I said, "Yeah, beginning to get that idea." But anyway, Sergeant Burns, and he was a fine fella. He wanted you to perform your duties, in basic training to excel physically. Basically, that was it, and we did. Our company, they awarded battalion awards, and our company topped the list. We excelled. We really did well in physical training, the rifle range, and all those things. And but so he said, since I was a member of the National Guard, I should probably be contacting the Adjutant General for the state of Kansas. His office was right there on post. So I went to him and explained my situation, and he says, would you be opposed to on-the-job training, working in a motor pool? And I says, no, that would be okay. I would do that. And he says, would I have any preference of where I served? I says, well, Fort Riley, Kansas would be nice. He says, yeah, he says, I bet you do think that. I still remember that. He says, I bet you'd like to go there, wouldn't you? He says, that just would be a little bit of a temptation to leave base every weekend and drive that 100 and some miles home. And I says, yeah, you're right. So he said, how about just staying there on Fort Leonard Wood? And I says, that's fine. So that's where I finished my 7 months, because several weeks had gone by, and I remained at Fort Leonard Wood during that initial service time of basic training and advanced training. So,
Do you want to move on to the next question?
sure, let's
Okay.
do it.
What were you doing prior to the war starting, or prior to your awareness of the war?
Well, as I said, I was working for private enterprises and in auto collision repair. I worked for the Ford dealer in Geneva for a year and a half or so. I don't remember exactly. And then for the company there in Byron, or it was actually, they had a lumber yard, and one of the owners had an interest in collision repair. So I did do some work for him, some rebuilds, and he got to drive nice cars for a pretty cheap price. And yeah, it worked out pretty well. Yeah, probably wouldn't have met my wife if I hadn't been working there or enlisted in the Belleville Guard Company.
And then you said you enlisted, but why did you enlist in Kansas and not Nebraska?
There weren't any, because of the ordnance factor. The training that they gave, or the follow-up, was in the fields of mechanic and auto collision repair, and so it was a natural fit. But Fairbury had at that time an enlisted reserve unit, and there were some of my friends who enlisted over there. But then they closed that unit down. It wasn't really active. Well, you went to your closest unit for convenience. And so a lot of those transferred into the Belleville unit too. I know there were 3 of them that did that.
How old were you when you enlisted?
21.
21.
Yeah, 20, 21. Yeah, it depends upon, I think I was 20, yeah.
Why did you join?
Well, Vietnam was raging, or just starting really when I enlisted, and I had that obligation to fulfill, and I figured I'd be better suited, or it would be in my benefit if I could be trained in a field that may be, how do I want to say that? I didn't see it as less, but I figured I had an advantage by going into a field that I was familiar with, where I could place myself in a better position in the military.
Yeah, instead of being drafted where they could put you anywhere.
And basically, we all retained our combat MOS. Once you went through basic training, that was your number one. And so they could have levied us for Vietnam straight into the infantry, but they chose to use us where we had our field of expertise.
And I guess, what was you said you had like an obligation or a duty, and why did you feel you had
Well,
that?
at that time, I think the duty to serve was more generally accepted. Not that it was expected so much, but it was accepted that you honored your country. And rather than what I see today by far. There was a kind of and once you got into the military, there was that esprit de corps that some probably wouldn't share my feelings on it, but it was as a feeling of pride that you were part of service to your country, that you honored your obligation, And I still remember being in school, and it was always a privilege to go hoist the flag. You know, a second grader, well, if you got that privilege, that was you jumped at the chance. And usually it was two at a time, so you wouldn't let that flag drop on the ground. While one clipped it on, the other one held the flag, and we didn't necessarily step back and salute, but once we got it up, we'd look up, you know, and pretty prideful of that flag. And I guess that's why and going to events, you know, especially I remember the Belleville stock car races, and they would raise that flag out in the infield, and how the crowd, that was following World War II in the early 50s, and how, you know, the whole crowd would stand and take off their hats and stand at attention while the anthem was being played on the speakers. And you just developed more so, I think, a national pride. And it is disheartening to see how, you know, our flag and our country is being disrespected, and our servicemen and women being disrespected. I heard on the news just overnight where this family was bringing home their son who had been killed overseas in combat, and on the plane home they were chastised for being a part of what used to be such an honor, and still is in some circles. But I fear for our country, I really do, for the future of our nation, when we have this attitude that of disrespect, and that's how I feel about it. I pray for our country that this won't become an all-encompassing attitude. We need to get back to our basic foundations if we're to survive. I really believe that, all my heart.
And you said you knew quite a few men your age enlisting, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There was, of course, the draft, and I enlisted for the draft, or registered for the draft, and we had I think the wake-up call was when you had to go for your physical. And they loaded us on a bus in Hebron one bright morning and shipped us up to Omaha, and that was an experience, I want to tell you. Yeah, what an experience. Because for the first time in my life, I looked around and saw 500 to 600 young guys all standing butt naked, you know.
That would be interesting.
And I was one of them. Oh, yeah.
That would be interesting.
It was one of those times when I wished they had us in an auditorium and all lined up facing outward and then bent over, and that was one time I wished I'd have had a photo. That'd have been a real Facebook treat.
Where were you living at the time when you enlisted? You said it was.
I was living in Byron.
Byron.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, actually, yes, I was. I was living in Byron. I had already come back from Geneva and had moved to Byron again, and yeah.
And you picked your service branch because of mechanics, correct?
Well, it was my inclination, my aptitude. Scores were high in that, and although I did like, you know, architectural design and things, monetarily I just couldn't afford to get into that field, and so I had high school aptitude scores. I favored that, I guess, and that was kind of a guiding thing for me, principle to kind of hang my hat on, because I knew I couldn't get into farming, and had to have some occupation in life.
Do you recall your first days in the service?
Yeah, I do. Basic training. Well, the National Guard was unexperienced, because you went for drills and IG inspections and stood in formation, you know, and then we did mechanical work there too, because I didn't get right from enlisting in the Belleville Guard Unit and go right to basic training. There was a lapse period of time there too. But I started working with the fellows there who had been through the schools and things, and I had that ability because when I was growing up, my father, like I said, had a mechanic shop. So when we moved to Byron to supplement their farming income, a lot of times in the wintertime, he would overhaul cars and vehicles for farmers, tractors, and I was his go-to guy. You know, when he was on the floor working underneath him, give me that 7/16 wrench, and I knew exactly what to get. And I learned, you know, through working with Dad, mechanical skills, overhauling engines. I was usually the one who washed the parts, but after a while he gave me the skills to bore an engine and fit the journals of the rods and mains on the crank, and so it became pretty. I can't say I was excelled in it, but in mechanics, but collision repair suited me better. I knew how to do that. Yeah.
What did it feel like to be?
Oh, enlisting?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. There were four of us who all enlisted on the same drill formation, and they took us in and had our sign. I remember the paperwork was just pretty thorough. We signed things, I don't even know what we were signing, probably kind of like this, you know. I read briefly a little bit about it, but there were documents upon documents that we signed, and one thing, when you signed your name, you became no longer your own. You were Uncle Sam's, basically, and but then the drills began, and I learned, you know, physical correctness about haircuts and all of that, you know. And what I remember about basic training, is that where you wanted to go?
Yeah, kind
Jordan?
of. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, sure.
Anyway, Jordan, that was kind of a fun time. Went in January. It was cold. Rode a bus down to, we missed our bus in Kansas City, and we're supposed to go from there to Jefferson City and then down to Fort Leonard Wood. Well, something on the bus line, it wasn't our fault, but boy, did we get ribbed by those veterans on the bus from there to St. Louis that we were going to be AWOL, and you know, they knew how to throw the fear of God into you. I remember that. We arrived there at night about 1 a.m, and no place to sleep because we hadn't been assigned to any duty roster or company area yet. And so we sat around, and the orientation was really fun. I spent about 10 days in the reception center, which is, for most people, it's a reception center of horrors. During that time, you're new, you get your hair cut, and I mean a shave job. It was down to the, you know, some of the guys running around today would feel really good about it. You know, they wouldn't even know they had went through the experience. But we were some of the first ones of our company to go in to get our hair cut, and they shaved you. And I remember walking outside, and we sat down on the cold ground, and several of the guys who I got to know pretty rapidly, and we said, oh, there goes in a guy with the, you know, full bushy hair. And so we said, let's see if we can recognize them when they come out. And I'm telling you what, Jordan, it was really amazing. It was hard to sometimes really place that face again with a bald-headed cue ball. But anyway, in basic training, then we were assigned our company area, and we were bused to those following the reception center.
I guess, how did Kathy feel about you?
I hadn't met Kathy yet.
Oh, you hadn't met her
after
yet.
basic is when I met her.
Okay.
I'm sorry, it was kind of complicated in how to get that, because when I went through basic, then I moved back to Byron, took up my job again, and then that's when I met Kathy.
Okay.
Yeah, I was probably 21 for sure by then. Yeah.
Okay, so she didn't really have a choice.
Yeah, I was. Yeah. No, I was still 20. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. She was several years younger. Oh yeah, she had a choice. She could have rejected me offhand, and she wouldn't even have thought anything of it probably.
You talked about Sergeant Burns, but
Yes.
what were your other instructors like?
Well, in a company you have 4 platoons. Basically, and each platoon is about 45 to 50 young guys. And so each platoon had a barracks. And in a company, you'd have 4 barracks plus the living quarters for the officers. You had a day room, you had orderly room where the officers worked and the sergeants worked out of. And then you had your mess hall. And so there were other first sergeants. And then you had senior drill sergeants, SDIs, and instructors, and they were usually, they expected everything of you. From the time you got up in the morning, usually around 4:30, till the time they turned you loose at night after your final formation. They were on you all the time. You had to have your footlocker just arranged so, toothbrush facing the right way, socks folded neatly, your bed, your bunk it had to be taut, so that if they stood above it and dropped a quarter, they'd better bounce a foot off of it. And it was a totally different deal, and the wake-up call in the morning wasn't kind. The buck sergeants, who were staffed on each end of the upper and lower floors of these cold old barracks, and they were coal-fired, no insulation. They were from World War I think, and coal-fired because the soot would come through the vents from the fans, and you breathe that in. So we got to the point where, I know I'm going very detailed,
Okay.
but we would go wrap T-shirt around your face so you wouldn't breathe that in, because we found so many of us were having to go, and they didn't like it, but if you got pneumonia and couldn't be on the duty, that was considered your fault. You were government property and you weren't taking care of yourself. But when half of the men were in the dispensary or in the off duty, they began to understand that there's something not right here. And so we decided on our own, we're not even going to start up the boilers. We will sleep in the cold rather than breathe that stuff. Because what it was doing, it was cutting your lungs and your larynx, and you'd start spitting blood. And so that was not a fun time. I'll have to be honest with you. It was cold. In Missouri, one thing about them, they have high humidity. So when it was 10 degrees there, the humidity added to it, it felt like it was 10 below or 20 below. And it was a miserable 8 weeks of basic training. But after that, for 2 weeks that I was off and then got into the AIT motor pool on the job training, then it warmed up. Missouri was a wonderful place. It was fun to be out and young, and still, physically, probably the best physical condition I've ever been in my life. That I will have to say. It was usually 9 miles every day out to the rifle range, and you carried your pack and your rifle, and plus all of the physical training you got besides that. Calisthenics, and there was never a moment when you weren't doing something physical, ever. And they demanded that you perform. I remember some of the guys, especially in the platoons ahead of us. I was in the 2nd platoon because the K, but A through E or so was 1st platoon, F through maybe M or so was 2nd, and then on down the alphabet. Those in the last platoon must have had a terrible time because of all the guys would literally physically drop. They couldn't make it. And you wouldn't see them until you were upon them, and then you'd have to jump over them. So you kept your eyes ahead in your line and watched for, oops, there's somebody jumping ahead of me. And so we'd be prepared to look for that person laying there on the ground. And a lot of them didn't make it. They would have to, they were called bolos. And so they'd have to, if they didn't make it, or if they were out because of physical illness or something for so long, they'd have to go through another cycle of retraining.
Oh.
Yeah, I made sure that, and I was small. I mean, I was really underweight at the time. I probably weighed 125 pounds. But I made sure that I didn't fall into that classification, because I was not going to go through that again. I mean, you go through 5 weeks and then all of a sudden you're sent back. Not me. I kind of rather, physically, I was in such good shape, I didn't really mind basic training. Now, I'd never make it. I would bolo for sure.
How did you get through it?
Actually, just encouragement from others basically on our floor. There were some real stinkers too, who made life just as tough as our squad leaders, or our sergeants. You know, there were some that came from basically larger cities, and they were, let's say, mentally not very nice. Anyway, so anyway, it was they tried to pile it on too. Where we had from the Midwest area here, around here, there were guys from Smith Center and other small communities, and we kind of formed a little group or cadre of our own, and we encouraged each other. Hey, hang in there. I remember there were several from Ruskin and Superior, Smith Center, Norton, Kansas, that we all went down on the bus to basic training together and wound up in the same company. And we tried to encourage each other, and if one was having difficulty or was ill, we would try to stand in for them as much as we could. That's how we got through it.
That's really cool. How did you learn about or receive information about the war, and how did that change your perspective?
Well, the war was pretty much broadcast on television all the time. I mean, it was a change in the way news, reporters went into the field, and it's even more so now with the advent of the computer and Facebook and all of that, But back then, television broadcasts really brought it back here, real life, and that, I think that's contributed to those that were anti-war, and you had that in World War II also. But you didn't have the organization and the graphic views that you did in Vietnam. Not even in Korea did they. But Vietnam was kind of a new age, so to speak, of media, and they would we'd be interviewed sometimes over there, but there was a huge difference in how the public perspective accepted our involvement in Vietnam.
And then I guess moving on to the topic of the Vietnam War, where exactly did you go?
I went to Zion, which was a small base north of Saigon, north of Ben Hoa Air Base, probably about 30 miles. It was in a region called the Iron Triangle, and it was noted for the heavy undermining. The tunnel systems in that area were really a network of Viet Cong tunnels and systems underground. It was always said, they ruled the night, we ruled the day. And our base wasn't all that big as far as military bases over there went. I served in the 3rd Maintenance Company, which was an attachment to the 6th, I never really got that, but I know it was like 678th Support Battalion, headquartered there right next to us, which was all maintenance or support. Basically, it was driven by the mechanical land vehicles, tanks, jeeps, trucks, all of that. We did the work on that. Even Xeon was a little base. It was pronounced Xeon, but it was spelled D-I space O-N. Dion. But it was Xeon. Never could figure out how they pronounced all those names. It was spelled totally different a lot of times. But our base was like 1.5 miles by probably 3/4 mile. Which compared to Long Bend, Benoit, and all of those, that was tiny. We were small. Even some of them up north of us a little ways were lot larger than ours. About every position, every component of the army that was on Xeon had a perimeter. There was no, like I said, they ruled the night, we ruled the day. It's probably changed a lot from that because of the technology and equipment and things, but for today. But so at night we provided guard duty, and actually because of our small company size, our guard duty was probably a lot more intense as far as the times you had to pull that duty compared to the battalion. We probably, on average, I probably pulled guard about 2 or 3 times a week. And you'd be 2 hours on, 2 hours off, or 4 hours off, and then 2 hours on. There'd be six men out at a perimeter guard post. And so during the daytime, basically you had your infantry. We supported the 101st of the 121st Infantry, and also the 11th Armored Cavalry. So the 1st of the 28th provided security in the countryside around our base. Infantrymen would go out, and sometimes during the night, a lot of them were out there in the perimeter, and that's where I thought, well, I'd see these guys coming in for a little bit of a break out of the field, and I'd think, wow, choosing enlisting instead of going draft was a godsend. It really was, because they lived out there in the field. We had a more probably secure area where we had we called them hooches, which were barracks, and they probably, in our company, we probably had 20 sleeping quarters. There were probably 16 men in each hooch. There weren't any women in our company. Mail call was always a highlight of the day when you got back from the motor pool in the afternoon. Mail call was really, especially by that time I'd been married, and it was always good to have mail call.
And when was this? I guess when did you go over? When was that?
Our guard unit we were a Kansas company under Kansas guidelines, National Guard of the state of Kansas. But on May 17th, 1968, orders came out from Washington, from the Pentagon, which this is really interesting because we were graded on our performance. The 69 Brigade, which is bigger than a battalion. You have your company, battalion, brigade, regiment, division. And the Kansas Brigade consisted of about 5,500 men, were deemed to be combat ready. And we were chosen, the rumors were flying that it was either going to be Nebraska or Kansas, which was going to be, and it was thought that Nebraska would be the brigade, which would be activated. Well, it came out, and we were all celebrating that fact, Of course, my brother-in-law, he wasn't too happy on that. He was a member of the Hastings National Guard. And my younger brother had enlisted with me, and in Belleville, or later. He was younger, so he didn't join. A couple years later, he joined along with half of his class. Again, the draft was active, and it was a great encouragement to get assigned to a duty you wanted to serve, if possible. But like I said, they could always send you into infantry. We were activated to federal active duty on May 17th, 1968, and so we all went to Fort Carson, Colorado. Loaded up all of our equipment, our old World War II trucks that we had maintained and had parked in the armory, and drove them out there. And that had to be one sad looking old unit, because some of those old trucks and stuff were 40 years old. And so we got out to Fort Carson, Colorado, and we were there until, and we were federal troops. We were no longer state controlled. We were federalized, just like any other active duty military at that time. We became part of the 5th Army out of Fort Carson, and boy, I can't remember what our company. We were just the 12th Ordnance. I think we kept that assignment with the 69th Brigade of the state of Kansas. And from that, instead of, it was the same as a draft, basically, because we fell underneath the rules of the federal guidelines where they would levy you into a combat zone. That was probably one of the hardest things to face, really. By that time we had a son, Andrew, and towards the end of that, he was born in November, and so there we were, living off post, my wife and I, with a baby. And what they were doing was, when you fell out into formation, excuse me.
No, you're fine.
When we went into formation of the company formation for duty in the mornings, then they would come out of the orderly room, usually with a list of men who had been levied for Vietnam. And there might be one, there might be 2 or 3, maybe 5 or 6 some mornings. And it wasn't all the time. But when you saw this first sergeant come out and he was a big rotund guy, when you saw him come out of there with a determined look on his face, you knew something was up. And so you stood there in line just hoping and praying that they weren't going to read your name, or your brothers, or your friends. No one wanted to see that. But then one morning, one afternoon, we were all working in the motor pool, and our lieutenant from Marysville, Kansas. Our unit Belleville was joined with the Marysville unit. We were part of that motor pool together. And the first lieutenant from Marysville came out and to the motor pool and called everybody out of the workshops, and whatever you were doing, drop it. We're having a company formation in the main motor pool area, and he had a list of about 50-some names. So your chances there were probably about, I'm going to say there were about 130 guys still there that hadn't been individually or small groups levied by that time. And of course my name was on that 50-some list, and my brother's was too. And we knew, that wasn't right. And they said that always came down from Washington, but I don't know. It seemed rather odd. It seemed rather strange that it seemed more of a company levy, that people in our company might have chosen you for that privilege. We still don't know. So anyway, that was just a feeling. Never was a proven fact. But anyway, it just seemed like it. From incidents that had taken place and things, during the course of our training. Anyway, I was on the list, went home and told my wife, And we came home. We had a weekend pass then to go home and tell our parents and everything, which we did. And it wasn't fun.
How'd they feel about it?
Oh, they were sad, of course, you know. And when my parents thought both of us were levied, David and I. But then military rules from the time of World War II, when the Sullivan brothers were all killed it had, if you wanted to, you could both serve. Well, I had already told my parents. David hadn't got back yet to do that. And so I said, nah, I'm not going to withdraw my name. Even though I'm married, he was married, they had no children yet. And so I said, nah, I'm not going to. He told me, he says, oh, Rod, take your name off. He says, I'll go. And I said, no, I've already told Mom and Dad, I'm going. And so that's the way we did it. And he felt bad about it. And I always told him, I said, don't do that. It's just how the timing was. And, you know, it'll all be okay. We'll be fine. But to this day, I think he regrets how that all went down. I know he sometimes, you know, he'll make comment of it. Should have been me, Rob. I said, nope, it worked out. We're fine. Good to go. But that was a tough time, tough period of active duty service, was those uncertainty, the uncertainty of the moment. And once it got there, though, and even it was uncertain once we landed. Once we landed in Benoit, and it was, we took different planes. We flew over on commercial jets. And got to tell you, as you got going over there, we noticed, and there were a lot of guys from around here. I flew on the same plane with about 4 or 5 other guys from Thurr County, because they did that big levy. And so as we got over, we noticed, different airlines, older stewardess, as we got closer to being over there. And the last ones were probably in their 60s, and they had seniority, so they could draw combat. They got some special flight pay for landing, going in and out of a combat zone, which was only right. I mean, you know, they deserved that. But they had the seniority, so they could get their paycheck up. I don't know if that was a wise move or not, but I never did hear of any commercial liners being hit or going down. So yeah, it just how it was.
So about how old were you?
At that time, I was 23.
23?
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember arriving in Vietnam, and what was it like?
Oh, yeah. We landed at Benoit Air Base, and that's where I was going. It was like 1 a.m, and we could see out of the windows as we were descending into Benoit. And the pilot came on, and he announced that there was enemy action in the area, and you could look out and you could see flashes of detonations. And so when we were in air-conditioned cabin, flying along there, whatever speed, 500 and some mile an hour. And but when we landed, came in, cruising in, and when he landed, it was a really tense moment, because we had no idea what we were going to face. No matter what kind of training they took us through out in the field at Fort Leonard or Fort Carson, you never really had it was a whole new perspective on life, because once they opened the cabin door and they said, go to the nearest bunker, take cover. And we had no idea where the nearest bunker was, and all the lights were out on the airbase, so it was dark. It was pitch black. And we got off and went down the steps, debarked from the aircraft, and took off running. But the first thing that hit me, 1 o'clock in the morning, it was still like about 95 degrees, and the smell was overwhelming. And I can still smell that smell today. It was not a pleasant smell. If you can imagine, it was kind of a rural setting, rice paddies with all the water, high humidity, and their hygiene habits weren't very good. So it reeked. It was just horrible. the whole time we were there. Groundwater, it rained so hard. Usually in the afternoon, the monsoon rains would set in about 4:30, 4 o'clock, and just drench everything. It might rain 5 inches, and where we were in our company area at Zion, and an hour later there wouldn't be a water puddle one. It was kind of a volcanic ash type soil, so it was porous. So all the rainwater pretty much it was gone. You might have some puddles where road traffic could pack it in, but basically it was gone. And because it was so porous, the drinking water had to be chlorinated to where you couldn't stand to drink it. It was horrible. And in our company area, they also had a mess hall, and the mess halls had big generator operated coolers where they made ice. Well, the ice around there, and you'd walk by those coolers, those freezers, and they were sitting in the sun, being fed electricity 24/7. The ice reeked so much of chlorine you couldn't stand to put it in a can of pop. It was terrible. It was just awful. Same way with the food. The food was all pretty much prepared by the Vietnamese women, which were hired to cook. And we lived on canned meats, canned fruit in our little hooches, our little barracks. We each had a little refrigerator, and each soldier in there in that barracks got. We were blessed compared to the guys out in the field. I mean, we had it so good compared to them, but still it was hard. But we had a little area about the size of a 6-pack of pop. That was your area, and you paid when you walked in the door for that privilege, that area to in case it went bad, you'd buy a new refrigerator. And sorry, I bumped that.
No, you're fine. It's still going, I think, yeah.
So that was nightlife. A lot of chess was played. We played endless hours of chess. That was the pastime. Following mess call and getting your can of fruit and a Pepsi or something, that was your nightlife. I never went to the mess hall. I went over at 150 pounds and came back at 119. And I was there for 8 months. I was hoping, because my 6 years obligation was going to run out before the end of, and then they were downsizing the troop force over there. Nixon was the president then. Under Johnson, it was built way up, and under Nixon, they were declining in force size. That meant more duty for everybody that was there to take the role of those that had left, including guard duty and mechanical duty. And at the motor pool, we had contact teams, which were teams of usually 3 or 4 men. And if there was a vehicle out in the field that required to be hauled in, if it quit running or if it was blown up or by the enemy, or if it hit a landmine, which weren't near as powerful as what we're seeing today, but they had them, and they'd sneak them in underneath the pavement somehow on the roads at night. But anyway, contact teams wasn't a choice thing to be assigned to duty, but we did it. M88 tank retrievers, we had those in the motor pool, and those had to be maintained. And if there was a M60, or I don't think that's right, but our tanks at that time, not the Abram, but the tanks at that time, I think they were the 60s, I'm not sure. But if one of those needed to be hauled in, you'd be assigned on the 88 to go get it, no matter where it was at. I mean, you went and got it. A lot of times we'd just have to take them to the salvage pool. Most of them weren't worth repairing. And then we'd haul them by truck down to Long Bend. And I remember going into the depot there at Long Bend, and there were just row after row after row, half-mile square of just nothing but engines. Out of whatever, there they were in row after row after row, set on pallets in the hot sun. Same with any kind of beverage, pop, beer. Basically, beer was available for the enlisted. No hard or liquors were available. That was only reserved for the officers. I guess they didn't want to get you too crazy. I don't know, but the beer would come, and it was terrible because I think it was packaged here before it was really ready to go. And it would and then sat out there in that hot 110 degree sun for months on end in pallets. Yeah, not the best beer in the world.
I guess you talked about some of your jobs and assignments working on Jeeps and trucks.
Yeah.
But was there anything else that you did?
Well, we worked on everything mechanical in our motor pool, from weapons. We had a weapons where they would repair any kind of handgun on clear through. I don't know, I never did get involved in it too much, but there was a separate little workplace for that. And basically probably the 50s and 60 caliber, they called them 50s, which were 50 caliber machine guns, and then they had the M60s, which was just like the M14 rifle round, so many millimeters. I forget what it was now. Guess my long term isn't as good as it should be.
You're fine.
But it was same cartridge I think they used, but we repaired a lot of the trucks, 3/4 tons, 2.5, 5 ton trucks and Jeeps, and they didn't have the some of the newer type of vehicles then yet. It was still basically, it was kind of like the old World War II equipment, only maybe with a more modernized engine, fuel systems and things.
What was your station and rank?
Specialist 4. Yep.
Did you see combat?
Not really. We stood in the motor pool, and there again, I felt really blessed that we didn't have to be part of that part, because I had some friends that didn't make it back home, and sometimes you feel like you maybe having the advantage of enlisting over those that were drafted. Sometimes I feel that maybe wasn't I can't say honorable, but you felt maybe just a little like you hadn't really fulfilled your obligation. Especially you'd see those young guys. I was 23, and you'd see these 18, 19-year-olds coming in the morning from the 1st of the 128th Infantry, and they'd spent the night out there guarding the perimeter out further than what we had. And I really felt sorry for those guys. They put in the heavy lifting. They really did. But yet, I guess that was kind of how it worked out. There were advantages that you could if you weren't drafted at a really young age, and if you did your enlistment, you were better off. That's just how the system worked, and whether that was right or wrong, sometimes I regret having to see them go out. Especially one day we went up to Fuloy from Zion, which was probably a 20-mile drive, and it was more of a combat for helicopters, the Hueys and the Cobras, which at that time were, heavy use in combat. And we arrived there at the air base one day, and they were bringing in the corpses of GIs, and to see them lined up, the body bags lined up there on the tarmac, was not a fun thing to see. They sacrificed it all. I mean, they gave the last full measure, as they say. But I guess in any combat or in any military, you need to support battalions. You need to support people to serve in that role too. So yeah, Vietnam as a whole, the experience, I wouldn't trade it for the world. But if I really had my choice, of course, anybody in their right mind would have said, let's don't do this, you know. But that's the way orders went, directives were given, and if a lot of them, what I really resented most of all was those that ducked the duty and found some political way out of it, or took off and went to Canada, and then they were pardoned later. That just really sent me through the roof. I mean, gee whiz, guys, that wasn't a very honorable way to support your country.
Did you or anyone did you or anyone in your unit come in contact with Agent Orange?
Oh yeah. Anybody that was in Vietnam, anyone who set foot in Vietnam was accepted as having been exposed to Agent Orange. And even brown water veterans, those that served in the rivers, didn't even set foot on soil. They were considered to have been exposed. Yep. So yeah, I'm a Agent Orange registered veteran. Yeah.
Were there many casualties in your unit?
Actually, there were few, because basically our compound at the time, I got there right after the Tet Offensive. And so there were, at that time, in Zion, there were casualties. But I got there just about 2 weeks after that occurred, in '68. And because the Tet New Year was, I think, January something of the year. And so I got there in February. And so just a few weeks after that. But while I was there, we probably had 10 or 12 wounded and a couple of combat losses. Yeah.
Did the casualties or seeing the body bags, did that affect morale?
Well, it certainly didn't give us any encouragement, I can tell you that. I guess you don't forget that, but you try not to let it be a part of your psyche. You go on with your job, do your duty, and oh, I forgot. Anybody that had under 100 days to go, you began automatically what they call the short time calendar. And I wished I'd have never done that, because it made those last 100 days just drag by. Just drag by. It was terrible. I wished I'd have never done it. And when I got down to about 12 days, I tore it up, threw it out, and never went back and looked.
What's the calendar?
You'd start marking off. Each day that went, you'd exit out on the calendar. 100 days, short time. They call that short timers. And yeah, there were a lot of them that were in their short time period that never came home too. But when we were there, President Nixon came over to review the troops, the process of the war. And I remember they called us all to the company area from the motor pool. We had no idea what was going on. And but we heard rumors, and it turned out to be so. But they had us all come back to the company. Everybody was to go into your barracks. Don't leave the barracks. Don't even think of coming outside. And all of our weapons were locked up in the rifle cages, so that they didn't want. And he was flying over with in a group of probably 80 to 100 helicopters.
Wow.
And they came up over the horizon from the south, and I think they were from Benoit Air Base, and they were flying across our compound, our Zion camp, and they were way high. I mean, you couldn't even hardly spot them up there, but you could hear them there were that many. And so we heard later that that was his entourage, his security with all of that went with that. And most of them were Huey helicopters, which were combat transport choppers. And you could always hear those. Most memorable thing was when my daughter worked in South Dakota for tourism. They honored the Vietnam veterans at Pier, and she invited me up, and it was an experience because there's something about the sound of only the Huey had. When it was coming towards you, you heard this wop 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 wop, and if there were in numbers, it was really something to hear. And there at the South Dakota celebration for Vietnam veterans, we stood on the banks of the Missouri River by the Capitol, and here come 6 or 8 of them over the tree line coming across the Missouri River. And I tell you what, it was spine tingling. It was like you were right back there. It really was well done. South Dakota really honored their veterans, and they held that every year. They had one year for the World War I's that were still alive. They put on a big deal. There weren't too many in attendance, but they were 95 to 105. And then the next year, I guess they did the World War II, then Korea, and then Vietnam. And they could probably keep going forever the way we're in combat all the time. But I remember that. That was really a nice tribute for the Vietnam veteran. Big parade and all day long event.
Can you give a brief portrayal of an average day during this time for you?
Okay, sure. That's easy. You got up and got uniform. And by the way, Vietnam had 2 seasons. It was either hot and dry or hot and wet. There was no cold. So you slept in what we thought was really comfortable lodging. For those in the Air Force, they slept in air-conditioned units. Ours were slotted so to shed the rainwater on the sides. They were screened, but you still had mosquitoes. And malaria was a hazard. I know quite a few Vietnam veterans that contracted malaria. But we had a little canopy over our beds, which were single cot with about a 2-inch mattress. And the humidity was so high that once you left the barracks during the day, and if it rained at night, you could depend upon you'd crawl in on sheets that you couldn't even turn over on because they clung to you. It was just wet. Everything was wet, and it smelled. Everything smelled. That horrible smell. But we had mosquito netting, and that was one thing that I was grateful for because I made sure every little corner was tucked in, sprayed in there a little bit, and went to sleep. And so what was your question again?
Your average day.
Oh, okay. We'd get up in the morning, get dressed, go to the refrigerator and grab a Pepsi and a can of fruit. And that was our breakfast usually. And then we'd go hop on trucks, which were formed we'd have a formation in the morning to make sure everybody was present. And then we'd hop on trucks and ride about half a mile to the motor pool. And then we would get off for our assigned duties. If you were on a team that was overhauling a 2.5 motor, that was your duty for the day. Because I didn't have the collision repair, I was I went the OJT route on the job training, so I became a mechanic instead of, you didn't straighten anything out over there anyway. If it was damaged, you'd put it in the salvage pool. So you had your daily assignment, and when you got a vehicle repaired, I was assigned at first to an inspection because we knew what the inspection involved and how to grade a vehicle. So we'd run them up on a ramp and crawl underneath them and check everything out and make sure that they were serviceable. If they weren't, they were deadlined, and then they would go through the process of being repaired before they were sent back out. So we had to have a little knowledge of when we looked at a vehicle, we could spot a problem. Or we test drive them, and if there was a problem anyway, we sent them for repairs. That's what I did for probably the first 3 months. And that was fairly easy, light duty. I liked that. But then later on, we got so busy because of the shortage of people. I was taken off of that and assigned to a motor pool bay with three other guys, and we would do the mechanical work that needed to be done. And then following that, then we would go back to our company area for the evening and do the same routine of Pepsi and can of meat or something from the refrigerator. And we would go about once a week. We'd buy canned goods at a little PX type store they had there on base, because I couldn't stand the food. You just couldn't, and it was horrible. They spiced it so strong with spices. Vietnamese like their food spiced, and boy was it spiced, because they had access to everything they'd need, through the military.
Tell me about a couple of your most memorable experiences.
Well, like I said, the trip to Fuloy to the incoming casualties, that wasn't a highlight. I think probably one of the highlights was off base. We had a USO club, and very few people even heard about it. But one afternoon, they came into the company area, and that was on a Saturday when we had just come back from the motor school. We worked 6 days a week. Sunday we had off, and Sunday was always a good day. Our chapel was clear at the other end of the base, so about 4 of us would, and we didn't have access to hop in a Jeep to run over there. We had to walk. But that was always a kind of a highlight of the week, to be able to go to chapel. There weren't too many men who were spiritually inclined to do it, but there were about 4 of us that on a regular basis we tried to make sure we got there. It was an all-faith chapel, and we had a good chaplain. He was really well versed in scripture and really enjoyed that time. But went to the USO club and volunteered, which in the military you're never supposed to do that. But they were looking for people to work in the USO club in the little town of Zion. And they had a USO club, which was the French were there. And so the architectural design of the building, it was an old hotel, French style. And my job for the day was to check weapons, so that when somebody came in, and they were just a steady line of guys coming in and out, you check weapons much the same as what they used to do to check hats or coats. And you'd give them a number for each weapon that they turned in. You weren't allowed to go in it with armed, because they served alcohol, and they didn't want fights breaking out with a vendetta or something like that with armed soldiers. And so we took weapons and gave them out their little tag for their number. And if they lost it, they were going to play heck getting it back, getting their weapon back. And so we always had to remind them, make sure you keep a hold of that. That's your weapon till we give it back to you. And we were checking weapons, and then I remember it was a longer hallway, but it had a little L-shaped event to the hallway. And working away, and I heard this voice, and I thought, wow, can't be. And I kept hearing this voice talking, and as it got closer, I thought, man, this is something else. And this individual stepped into the doorway to check his weapon, and here was my old Sergeant Burns from basic training.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, I hadn't seen him in like 4 years, or 3 years, and something like that. And so I said, we introduced ourselves. We didn't have to. He recognized me because he's the one who saw me sitting there doing virtually nothing and wasting my time, who gave me the advice to go see my adjutant general of the state of Kansas. And he remembered me, and I remembered him from his voice, because he was I remember basic training. He says, I'm going to be your mom and your dad, but he says, you're not going to like the dad part of me. But while you're here, if you have problems, come to me. And he was that kind of guy. He was a black man, and he was just the nicest, gentlest spirit you'd ever hope to meet in your life. And he lived up to what he said. He'd be your mom, he'd be your dad. He looked after us. And I loved that guy. And I really did. We just got along so good. He had been a World War II veteran, but he got out after several years in combat, and he made it back to the States, and he could not adapt to civilian life. He just struggled because it interrupted his life from the time he got out of school, and he didn't have the advantages, to go. He just didn't like civilian life, so he rejoined the military. And he had served for like 19 years or 20. Anyway, he was just short of retirement at 20 years when I went through basic training. So he re-upped so that he could get his full 20 years, and he thought he'd be there at Fort Leonard Wood doing, they had downsized. That was during Nixon's years. They were downsizing our forces over there, and they were training the South Vietnamese Army, the ARVN. And so they sent him over there to train the ARVN. And he says, Rod, you will not believe how disorganized the South Vietnamese Army is. He says, they just don't understand anything. He says, it isn't working, is pretty much what he was telling me. But anyway, he says, find somebody else to do your duty. He says, we got to talk. And so for a couple hours over the only steak meal that I had while I was there, and it probably was water buffalo, I don't know, but it was pretty good. And we sat and talked and shared a few beers. And Sergeant Burns, that was one of the highlight days of my duty over there. It was. I always said, they tell us never to volunteer. Well, that was one time I volunteered, and I rarely did, but it worked out. It was a good day.
Cool. That's so cool. Were you awarded any medals or citations, and how did you get them?
We were just combat. We were assigned to support the combat units, and so as part of that, we had the Vietnam Service Medal Award, and there were several other minor decorations that we received. I really never looked into it too much. I was listed on our discharge and things like that, but I always felt, hey, that little Vietnam ribbon, that's kind of neat, but it was a little red and yellow striped ribbon, and then there was a totally red one too. I don't remember what that was, but the Vietnam ribbon, it was placed over a hard surface and then attached with a pin to your uniform, and it was pretty cool.
Cool.
Wear that.
What was your understanding of why the U.S. was involved in Vietnam?
Well, we thought, it was kind of a continuation of democracy for South Vietnam that was being overrun by a dictator of communist North Vietnam, and we thought we were furthering, and I really think that was the cause, to try to maintain a democracy for the people of South Vietnam, much the same as what Korea, the peninsula, is divided. That's really, there was the DMZ in South Vietnam too until we decided to pull out, and we saw the results of that reoccur when we went out of Iran. There wasn't a demilitarized zone, but there was a border between Iran and Iraq and Syria, and those were overcome by the enemy. They just didn't relent.
How were soldiers treated, and did they get proper care?
Soldiers, I think, in Vietnam were treated as respectfully as you could. I mean, given the circumstances, there were those who had it far worse than others. I mean, that was a given. It was just the role that they were thrust into that through no fault of their own. Like I said, the Air Force, if I had to re-enlist, I believe it'd be the Air Force. They lived in pretty much the lap of luxury compared to the Army. And I'd advise young people looking at a military career, check out the Air Force. It's you're not out there in the gravel pits and bunkers looking out with the prospect of facing the enemy eyeball to eyeball anytime soon.
Will you describe the atmosphere of what people were feeling during the war?
Well, in America, it was really divided. I think among the troops, though, I think probably 99.9% of the fellows that were there, some of them were drafted, quite a few, but even they still respected their responsibility and their duty to serve. And you never heard too much dissension, hardly at all. I mean, they were there, we did our job, we're going to get it done and go home. And that's pretty much the way it was. I mean, there were no... I think the worst thing about the whole time over there was we had a magazine called The Stars and Stripes. It was produced and published by the U.S. Army, I guess, because everybody, you could get a copy. It was kind of like a small folded newspaper. I think closest to that, there was an old newspaper that was in publication here called The Grit. But this was the Stars and Stripes, and it told about different things happening in South Vietnam. I mean, it was about combat. It gave stories and pictures and testimonials of soldiers who had been in combat, gave the list of those killed in action, those wounded in action, and I think it was like on a weekly, might have been a monthly, but I think it was a weekly publication. And on one publication, I'll never forget, that came out, and it gave, since you're asking about the political aspects, it gave both sides what was going on politically, and those that supported and those were anti-war. And on one of the Stars and Stripes, there was a fold out, and lo and behold, there were pictures of the North Vietnam anti-aircraft military. And among those was a white gal sitting on an anti-aircraft gun emplacement with a hard hat, a helmet on, a North Vietnamese helmet on, and it turned out to be an American, Jane Fonda.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, Jordan, that was probably the most difficult thing for us who were in service at the time to see that. Because here we were thinking we were doing right by serving the U.S. military, and then to have what Jane Fonda portrayed to us as a very liberal traitorous. And that was probably one of the hardest things to accept for anyone who was on active duty in Vietnam, to see that image of her. And there were others, you know, and then to hear about the protests that were going on, Kent State, and that all happened while I was there, I think. I'm not positive on that, but John Kerry being at the standing before Congress and giving his spiel, and now they are in higher political realms. You know, I'll be glad when that era of anti-war protesters like myself will be departed from this earth. I think that they're a detriment to our continuing as a free land. They have their political views. I don't agree with them. And so you know where it is politically today. As far as I'm concerned, I think our nation is in big trouble. I can go into detail on that if you'd like later. But I know you're probably ready to get jetting out of here too.
Oh, no, I got a whole bunch more questions to ask.
All right, okay. Okay, I'll try and keep it short.
If you gotta go.
No, I'll go on.
Okay. Did you communicate with friends, family, and sweethearts back home?
Yes.
And how'd you do it?
Yes. You know, today you can get on a computer or on an iPad and you can just go to town. Back then, all we had was letter writing. and no telephone service. So it was by shortwave radio. And that privilege was very limited, really limited. And so, but letters, my wife and I, if we didn't get a letter within 4 or 5 days' time, you know, something was wrong. And so we do correspondence that way. The other thing was we had the little reel-to-reel cassette recorders. You know, not the enclosed, encapsulated little cassette you'd stick in. These were reel-to-reel, and you had to wind them on and all of that. I still have some of those. I've never heard of them, never did listen to them again. But we had those little recorders, and my daughter told me, she says, Dad, she says, give me those. And I was going to do that, and I forgot to take them up there. But she said that there are people in Hastings now that can transpose those onto a disc. Mm-hmm. So I want to do that. But our method was those little reel-to-reels, and my mom and dad would, and that's some of the first words I heard my son say was on one of those.
Oh.
Yeah. And I had a picture Kathy sent me, and I put it in a little frame and kept it in my locker. And Andy was probably about 6 months old then, and she had him dressed in a little white sailor suit type thing.
Oh.
Blonde hair. He was cute, and it was she had taken him to the studio in Hebron, had a photograph, and I remember once we had in our barracks, the government hired Vietnamese women to come in, and they would clean, dust, and organize your shoes, and if you wanted them to shine your shoes, you could pay them a little bit, and they'd do that. We never wore them. They were just there for appearance, for inspections, about once every 3 months. So anyway, she sent me that photo, and I had it framed. And just a little round stand-up framework, and I had it in my top of my wall locker, and the mama-san, we called him, happened to be in there when I came off guard duty, and I had my wall locker open, and she saw that. Oh, so number one baby son. And I says, oh yeah. And she wanted to know all about him. Well, we slept during the daytime following guard duty. So I would sleep, and she didn't bother. You know, there was nothing intimate or anything between. But one time I was in there sleeping, and there was another soldier who tried to force her into sexual activity, and I said, hey, and he had come in there from some other company. He was a transfer through, and I said, this isn't happening, not while I'm here. And boy, after that, she was so grateful for me. But getting back to this photo, when I woke up in the afternoon, she had waited for me to wake up. And here, all of the other gals that worked in there were probably 30 in the company. She had them all come over. She wanted to show them this number one baby son photo. That was cool. But I forgot your original question after I got done.
Did you communicate with friends and family?
The only time that I was able to communicate with my wife was by, I've said it before, not walkie-talkie, not CB. It's where you transfer
the radios.
The radios. I forget what it was called, but they had a guy on base at the West End again by the chapel, and you had to go down there and you had to make an appointment for your time slot, and you got 5 minutes. And shortwave radio. And so, but that was broadcast from station to station across the Pacific, so you had to be transferred through all of these different ham radio operators. And my wife wasn't expecting a phone call. When it came, I don't think she was prepared for the procedure. She knew I was going to try and call that afternoon. And then when we finally did get through, she was so excited she always forgot to say over and out or Roger or, those technical terms you needed to do. And finally I had to remind her, honey, you got to say this or we'll be shut down. And sure enough, after about 3 or 4 minutes, one of the operators along the way said, "That's enough of that," because it was protocol. It was, you had to do it. And she was so excited she wrote me a letter which I received in about a week later. And she said, she couldn't believe how stupid she was for not following the procedures. And anyway, but that was great. That 3 minutes was gold.
Yeah, I bet. You said the food was gross, but
Oh, yeah.
what did they make Vietnamese food and serve it to you, or did they make American or attempt to make American food with Vietnamese spices?
Yeah. See, the food was all procured through the military. I mean, it was shipped over there. And if you had a good chief cook or mess hall unit like back here, Missouri was some of the finest food for breakfast I ever ate. I mean, it was just all you wanted, and it was really done well. But over there, they received the same rations, or through the military. It was produced in America, transported across, and you'd have all of the foodstuffs that normally you'd have here. It was refrigerated, but they spiced it up so much, and you just couldn't stand to go in there. And come back here, and now they're opening up Vietnamese restaurants. And I go, I'll pass.
Why?
Some people like it, but it's usually a really high-spiced food.
What were some of the supplies they sent you, and did you ever feel like you never had enough?
I think, well, food-wise, I don't think, it could have been a whole lot better. But, there was a Sunday afternoon when we had there was an orphanage in the area. And the USO brought in, they put on a little show, and a lot of them were Vietnamese, mainly young gals who worked with the orphans. They were orphans themselves, and they would bring in these orphans, and then we were assigned an orphan to visit with. And then they would put on just we had a little flat stage built by the mess hall. They constructed that real hurriedly with a couple of steps up so you could see them. And they put on little skits and shows, and they tried to sing in American, and it was really a fun afternoon. We had some 50-gallon barrels that they made into grills, and they grilled some hamburgers up and stuff, mainly just volunteers. And in the evenings, they showed outdoor movies. They had a screen, which was actually the side of the mess hall, and then the bleachers set up before that. So in the evening, there was that entertainment. If you didn't like playing chess all night or sitting around talking, you had that. Yeah.
What were your emotions?
Leaving was very hard to go across. It was really tough especially since I was married and had a little baby boy. That was hard. We said our goodbyes to Andrew, and then Kath and I and a friend of mine from Belleville, Howard Reed and his wife, which were good friends of us from Fort Carson. We drove up to Omaha and got on a flight and had our orders, and flew to Denver and then to Oakland, California. Actually, we flew to San Francisco International, and then they took us to Oakland by bus, and then a couple days later, or a week later, they transferred us back, and then we took off from there on commercial jetliners and flew across. That was hard to say our goodbyes at Omaha because the flight was out like 4 a.m, and the gals drove back home, and we took off and flew to Howard Reed and I. He was a little younger, but he was a really nice guy. We got along so well, and then we were separated once we got there. He went to Long Bend and I went to Zion.
You talked about.
And he was married and had a little baby boy too.
Oh, that's crazy.
Yeah, yeah. We talked about what?
I guess so. You talked about how people would entertain themselves with chess and movies.
Yeah, that was the evening entertainment.
Did you ever have any entertainers?
Just at that USO. Oh, yes, we did. Yeah. I don't think it was Bob Hope, but I know that Ann Margaret was one of the gals who came over. I'm not sure whether Bob Hope was there or not, but it was on our Zion base camp, and anybody that wasn't signed to duty post could go. And they came on I think it was like a Friday afternoon, and they were there a couple hours, and then they went on to other posts, But yeah, that was fun to see. There were probably several thousand guys in the audience, and to get front row seating, you probably had to get there sometime during the middle of the night. I mean, it just lined up. People sat on the ground and brought chairs or whatever, But it was fun.
What did you do on leave? When you were on leave, were you on leave?
I didn't get any leave.
You didn't get any leave?
I was there if you weren't going to be there a full year, you didn't get rest and relaxation, R&R, which was usually, I think, 2 weeks. And you could choose. A lot of them went to Australia. Most of them went to Japan. Australia, Japan, Thailand were 3 of them. But if you weren't there for a full year, which I knew I wasn't going to be, you didn't get it.
And you were there 8 months.
Yeah.
Correct? Okay.
Mm-hmm. Going on 9, but...
Do you recall any particularly humorous or unusual events?
There was always something. I remember just the ordinary guys, pulling stunts and stuff, but humorous events. Extraordinary events. I don't think there was really anything other than I've already said about Nixon flying over, or that was extraordinary, we thought.
Did you ever pull any pranks?
Oh yeah. Short sheeted beds, or out on guard duty, it was always kind of fun to send a runner back to the orderly room and tell them we thought there maybe was something going on in the perimeter that they ought to be alert to, and they'd send usually the officer of the day and another guy would come over there to check things out, and then we'd have to. Yeah, it was happening. We know it was, but.
Did you?
When they got there, it was always. When they got there, of course, what we had been claiming had already happened, and they would get tired of that. But that was just kind of a way to have a little fun. I don't think we had the humor that the MASH portrayed. No, it was pretty serious, time consuming. You just wanted to get it over with. Humorous things. We had a nighttime. We thought it was incoming rounds coming down the line because these bright flashes were going off, and we were all sitting out on the theater bleachers, probably 50 or 60 of us, and we heard these loud kabooms, and we could see coming down the line straight towards us were these flashes, and it looked like incoming rocket rounds,
Wow.
coming our way.
Uh-huh.
And in the evening, when you got back from the motor pool, you showered. You were just greasy and dirty, and so after that, you walked around in just shorts and shower shoes, and that's how you spent your evening because it was either hot or wet or hot or dry. So, and we were sitting out there on the bleachers when this started, and it just came rapidly across us, and everybody thought that's what it was. So we took off for the bunkers, which were half a block away, and just ran and dove down these bunkers. Guys were tumbling over the top of each other and trying to take cover. And it turned out to be a perimeter. They were flying over with a plane, and they were dropping out some sort of a flash type thing, which were making this boom sound. We thought it was on the ground, but they were really flashing. They were taking photographs of the perimeter from an aircraft. But it was realistic for, we heard rockets coming in occasionally, but this was a definite. And the next morning, I guess it was really humorous because of all the shower shoes that were laying there. Just everybody ran right out of them, and then when it was dark, you weren't going to go looking for your shower shoes.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that was kind of funny.
Do you have any photographs?
Oh,
or did
yeah.
you take any
I took a
photos?
lot of photos. I sent back things. My relationship always wanted me to go. They had little shops. About anywhere you went onto a base, the Vietnamese would have shops, and they would make all kinds of things. They sold all kinds of things, and they were just little outdoor. They'd set up kind of like a bazaar, a sidewalk bazaar, and they'd have roofs over them with walls on, but the front would be open. So they'd come in and they'd set up their little sales offices, and they'd sold everything. They sold skeins of silk. That was a sought after thing. They sold candlesticks, and they were very ingenious. They would take the copper or brass from the artillery rounds, and they would melt that down, and that became a candlestick. Everywhere you went, there was incense burning in these little things, and I mean, they religiously burn up more incense. I think it was derived from the water buffalo excrement, but it did smell. Oh Lord. They try and mask it with some perfume of some sort, but it was horrible. But yeah, I sent back a lot of items, and about a month before I knew I was coming home, and that I'd bought for different people, and I didn't even think about it. Everything was duty free, and so we just packaged it up and put the address on there and shipped it back. And letters were the same way. And just had to put our company, designated mailing address on it, and that was it. But most of the things that I bought, I put in a one large shipment of 2 boxes, and I never even gave it a thought to insure it. Well, that got about as far as the first U.S. Postal Service, I think, and whoever was working in there knew that if it wasn't insured, it was free game. And so those things didn't make it. But for some reason, right before I shipped it, I thought I had a camera, and I had taken a lot of slides, and I had a shoebox full of slides, and most of them I've seen a couple times, but they've been up in the closet for a long time too, like those reel-to-reels. And I hand carried those back. Got back to Oakland, California, and there we were held in an area probably, before we flew out, they gathered us all into a detention point. I think it was called a detention point, about 6 square blocks. And there must have been 8,000 guys in there until your orders for your plane, and then you would be bused to an airport and flew out. Got to tell you, those were memorable days. Got there, and this was on Long Bend, large, open, no perimeters really on Long Bend. So the enemy could be running right around in your unprotected perimeter. And mortar attack took place, and they were aiming at the a fuel depot, which was probably 4 or 5 blocks away. Well, some of those rockets, they weren't even close. Here we were in this large, confined, lots of men, and no bunkers. All you had was maybe a sandbag or 2 and your mattress. So we were all hunkered down underneath a mattress, hoping that no shells would land anywhere near us. And that was a real fascinating time. They never even hit the depot, thank God, because that would have been pretty devastating for But then when we got, you want me to go on?
I don't
On a
care.
flight
Yeah,
home?
You can, yeah.
Yeah, on our flight home, I flew over with a fella from Hebron, LaRue Wolfcutter, and sitting in the hangars, big hangars at Long Bend Air Base, and big hangars, and it was all open. They were just the roof over the top shed the rain, and there must have been several thousand GIs waiting there to board their flight home. And we called them freedom birds. And I heard this laugh among all those guys, and I thought, man, that can only be one. And it was LaRue Wolfcutter. I stood up and I hollered, "Hey, Wolfie!" Above all the noise and all the talk, I hollered, "Hey, Wolfie!" And about 18, 20 rows behind me here, Wolfcutter stood up. And he recognized me, you know, and we got together, and our orders had us flying on the same plane back, so we sat on the same plane going over, and then on the same plane going back. And I remember they were 707s, 2 gas or fuel guzzling engines on each wing, and that was the top of the line at the time, the 707. Anyway, we were on board, taxiing down the runway, and the moment that the wheels left the ground, the roar of the guys in there was really that was memorable. I'm sure it happened on every flight out, but for us, for myself, it was really an inspiring moment. Everybody was just yelling, top of our lungs.
Oh, cool.
And then we got to Oakland, and we were put in kind of another center in processing we were National Guard. Yeah, they still had us as this silly National Guard on our tag, on our orders, and they didn't know what to do with us. So for 17 days, we got back on November, about the 20th of November. We figured we'd be home in time for Thanksgiving. And we sat around there in Oakland for another 2.5 weeks, waiting to be processed out because they didn't know whether to send us back to Fort Carson or to just simply discharge us as they were doing regular Army people. And finally, this went on, and we slept. We carried around some things that we wanted to bring home. I had my camera and my shoebox full of photos, but anything like Army field jackets or shoes, extra pair of boots or anything, I still remember there was a great big pile of boots where guys just got plain tired of carrying them around. Big pile of field jackets. All of that stuff when we threw them away. I mean, and anyway, what was I going with that? Then from there they put us on buses, green Army olive green drab buses again. Probably they were small, 36 passenger maybe, and shipped us back over to the airport in San Francisco. And that's when we encountered, at night, about 2 a.m, we encountered these anti-war protesters sitting along the bridge on the Oakland side and on the San Francisco side. It was over San Francisco Bay, but it wasn't the Golden Gate. There's another bridge, and a large bridge. And as we went over, they were throwing bottles and rocks and spitting on the bus, hollering at us, baby killers and all of that stuff. And that was pretty disheartening. Of course, they had been reading all about My Lai, or all of that, and how that went down and things. And it wasn't a very cheerful way to come back. But we went on over to the airport, got on the planes, and I remember the stewardess. Once we flew to Denver, and from Denver, they had issued us brand new Class A uniforms. We were still in our old Army fatigues that we wore over there. They were worn out, they were faded. They washed them in the Saigon River, the women, South Vietnamese women, and then they'd starch them with something, I don't know, but they were as stiff as a board all the time. ugly to wear. But I took the photos, and we got on the plane, and we flew to Denver, but they had issued us these brand new Class A uniforms. Shoes, the whole ball of wax. That was just for our flight home. And I thought, what a waste of money. You know, there's probably $150, $200 for each uniform that they discharged you in. And it was unreal. Why? You know, they fitted us for size and everything again, and why? And it was just ridiculous. And once we got to Denver, though, I remember the stewardess that was on there. She could not believe that she was on a flight with returning GIs, and she looked after us in that hour's time back to Lincoln like we were long lost brothers. She was great. Never forget. Don't know her, what her name was. Like to know so I could thank her, but she was about our age, you know. Very, very kind, very nice. Real warm spirit to be welcomed home by. Then when we got to Lincoln, we came off the plane. There's 4 or 5 of us. Howard Reed, again, and Wolf Cutter and myself and a couple of the guys from Marysville unit got off on the same plane. And our parents, our loved ones, my wife, were all waiting. Andy, they didn't bring him along. He was at home, but he was over a year by that time. And but my parents brought my wife up, and that was a neat. But I had lost so much weight. Mom was just, Rod, what happened to you? You know, I was like 119 pounds. And yeah, I saw photos of myself, videos that my wife's father took on our arrival. But we thought we were going to get home for Thanksgiving. We didn't get back until December the 12th. And so, long time past our discharge date from Vietnam took place before we finally got out of there. Oh, and by the way, for making the decision on where we were going to process out, whether we were going to be shipped back to our original company, the Belleville National Guard Company, or sent right directly home, the decision was made by a specialist E4 like myself. He said, hey, these guys have been they're federal troops. They're no longer National Guard troops. They shouldn't be treated as such. They should be discharged on the spot at Oakland, put on a plane and sent home. Their duty is done. And I still remember that. All these captains and colonel was running ragged trying to figure out how they were going to process us out. And we stood there all that time. 2.5 weeks, 17 days. And finally, it was all decided by a specialist.
Jeez.
Yeah.
What did you think of officers or fellow soldiers?
There were your goods and your bads. You know, I tell you what, I think more was expected, especially of the your non-coms, non-officers in the Belleville, Marysville Guard units while we were stationed in Fort Carson than what they really were rigid. I could have done without. When we were in Vietnam, we did our duty. We were treated no different than anybody else, and I think as far as rigid training, Belleville cadre of the enlisted non-commissioned officers, the sergeants, was probably more stringent. I'd compare them more like basic training. I don't know whether that was because they just liked to lord it over you or because they just felt it was their duty to stay on top of you. But regardless, that's how it was done. And I remember the one master sergeant who was from Marysville, the guys, and he was levied for Vietnam also, and several of them told him, "We hope you're not in our company. You may not be coming back." And that brought a whole new perspective for him. I mean, he mellowed quickly. He really did. And he was in some of their company, you know, in their acquaintances while he was in Vietnam. Then we had some really good guys too. I got to say that. We had a couple of officers from Belleville, and both of those warrant officers were assigned duty in Vietnam, and we got back, and they were wonderful all the time. They were older. We got back, and we had a big company party, a barbecue, pig pork barbecue, and a fellowship at the armory, and that was pretty much it. You know, that came later. That was along about in May, probably.
Did you keep a personal diary?
No, I didn't. Just didn't have time for it, basically. My memory always served me pretty well, and so it was. There were good times. There were some hard times too. Especially when you'd hear of a family member, an uncle or an aunt had passed away, and you couldn't be there. That was hard. Yep. Getting the tapes was fun, but it was hard to listen to them. You know, hear your voice of your son for the first time saying "Dad," or that was hard. But it was good to have, because I wore them out just about by replaying them. And of course, I was one of the few married guys in there. I was 23. There was one other fella from Ohio in our hooch. We called him Gramps. He did look a lot like the Gramps on Walton's Mountain. And he had that kind of that slouchy feel to him, like you could envision him in a pair of coveralls real easily. We called him Gramps, and he was married and had a couple of kids. He was in the enlisted reserve, and which was similar to the National Guard. But yeah, and I got to know some guys really well. There was a Jerry West from Silver Springs, Maryland. I haven't seen him or contacted him since. Just some neat people. Really good American soldiers.
What was your opinion on being involved in the war back when it was happening?
Like I said, I just felt it was an obligation. I felt the call. Closest thing to a call, I guess, I felt was to service. Yeah, granted, it was somewhat under forced circumstances with the draft, but still, I don't know, I probably, even though the draft was on, if it would be like today in a volunteer force, you'd be surprised the number of guys who enlisted at the time might have done so on their own without the feel of the threat of the draft forcing them in a way. I don't know that I would say whether I would have or not. It was, I felt a pride in serving. I really did. Finishing basic training and what we accomplished physically as a unit and working together was something that I won't forget. The people that were involved with it, yeah, it was Sergeant Burns. There were others there though that were served in his capacity. Sergeant Burns told me the sergeant drill instructor for the 3rd platoon, which was like from L's through R's, he was a turd. He was a nasty man, and he would physically handle the troops in his platoon. And I remember there were 2 young guys, 3 from, one was in mine, from Oak, or Nora, Nebraska, and a couple of them from Ruskin. Gail Michelson was one of them, and he was in that 3rd platoon, and he was mistreated by this Sergeant Ehlers. Maybe I shouldn't be mentioning names.
That's okay.
But he was abused, and he wasn't the only one in that company. Well, Sergeant Burns, at that chance meeting at the USO Club, we got to talking about Sergeant Ehlers and how mean he was. And I said, I was so blessed by being in your platoon. I learned so much. But even though that was the case, those guys that were under Sergeant Ehlers they suffered. And he says, yeah, and apparently he said his wife must have too. He didn't treat her any differently. I says, oh, why is that? He says, well, Sergeant Ehlers is no longer with us. His wife, being beaten and battered, shot him while he was sleeping. Yeah, killed him. Killed him right there on Fort Leonard Wood. Yeah. So
You just had enough.
yeah, he was a mean, evil guy, and he got his just dues.
Wow.
Yep.
Was there a big turning point with your involvement?
Oh, big turning point. Probably getting levied. You know, the early morning notice that you had 30 days leave before you went to Vietnam. Yeah, that was a big turning point. We got time alone, Kath and I. We moved back to Hebron, or to Deschler, actually to Byron again. And I made preparations for my leave. She didn't want to live with her parents, and I could understand that, you know. And she didn't want to live with mine. And I said, well, where would you like to live? And she said, well, my hometown was her hometown. So she wanted to live in Byron. It was a little community. And so, I forgot to add in there, but before I was levied, while I was levied for Vietnam, a friend of mine and I, we found jobs in Manhattan, Kansas. And that's when I continued my relationship with Kathy. She was a freshman at K-State. Anyway, instead of moving to Manhattan again to take up classes, she said she'd rather just live there locally until I got back. And so we went and bought a mobile home. And my dad had one mobile home set up behind on their acreage there in Byron. And so they put in another unit space and the facilities to equip it for electrical and, you know, utilities. And so she lived there. And our paychecks at the time were minimal. I mean, minimal. But we set it up on a payment schedule to pay for the trailer. So once I was back home, we moved it down to Manhattan again, and we resumed my job there with the Chevrolet Cadillac dealership until probably 1973. Then we decided to open up our own business, and we moved to Deschler. And I had a shop here in town for 23 years. Then I took over the job as the Thayer County Veteran Service rep and worked there for 19 years till I retired. And, don't even know, but I was 67, so 6 years ago. Yep.
Okay. How much were you informed on what was happening related to the war and why it was happening?
The probably the best contact was through the Stars and Stripes. I mean, that told you what was going on pretty much politically and what was involved in what was going on strategically in South Vietnam. I mean, it pretty well kept you up to date. It was a good little publication. I'm not even sure where it was published, in Saigon or someplace, or Long Binh Air Base or wherever it was. But it's still an ongoing publication. I don't know if it's still called the Stars and Stripes, but it's a military journal on activities in the military. And it told the good things, it told the bad things. I mean, it was across the board. Yeah.
What was the hardest part of the war?
Going over. Yeah. Getting on the plane, saying goodbye to your wife and your family. That was probably the toughest. Best thing was the reversal. Mm-hmm. Coming home and saying hi. Yeah. That was probably the toughest. And the uncertainty of knowing what you were going to be doing there, where you were going to be, and, you know, your duty assignment once you got there. We got there and we probably were 4 days in a holding center till they processed you to your duty assignment. And once they loaded you on a truck, up the highway you went, you didn't know where you were going. And that was uncertain. Yeah.
And then talking about the end of the war, did you watch the news a lot during the Vietnam War, and how did you feel about the news coverage?
Well, once I got home, yeah, I watched it because, of course, I was interested in what was going on. I mean, I'd spent 8 months of my life plus another 5 years and 10 months of my life being involved with the military. So, yeah, I watched it, all the old broadcasts, journalists that were reporting. I think they were pretty fair about it back then. It was kind of disturbing to see some of the reports of the protesters and how they were treating my fellow comrades in arms when they got back. I didn't appreciate that, especially knowing 3 of them that were sent home in flag draped coffins. That was another thing. One of them was a friend of mine, a family friend. His parents lived at Nelson, and I heard about his demise while I was over there. And anyway, I went to visit his mom and dad afterwards, and she was receptive to be gracious to see me home. And I never gave that a thought, I just wanted to extend my condolences, but I never gave it a thought that how they must have felt. Well, our son didn't make it home, but Rod did. But she was very open and warm in greeting me. But his dad was working out on the farm, which was, it was directly contacted Dad's farm. And so I went out there and with Dad. And he was working on an old grain bin, and he just broke down and he got angry. And I just excused myself and extended my sympathies, but then I realized how hard it was for him to see me walk up there, and his son never would, And he held that, not a grudge against me, but he never did recover from his loss. I know I saw later on in life his marriage deteriorated. He was older too, but they just kind of grew apart where they had been very loving relationship. And I remember when she died, I sang at her funeral, and he was really emotionally disturbed. I tried to talk to him even then, and it was hard for him. It was hard for me to see him in that state. He just never did. Kind of blamed. To him it was a useless war that he lost his son, and yeah, I could understand that. But yet his son, he should have been proud of him, because the way I heard that his company was overran on a hill, and he didn't have a chance. But they'd even called in aerial support on their own position to try and fend off the enemy. Didn't work, and he lost his life. He was one of 7 of a company that was still alive on the last morning, and then they were overrun.
How did your family and friends feel about your homecoming?
Oh, it was fun. I think everybody, my sisters and brother, and that was another thing. My brother was still at Fort Carson, and it was an interruption in our life, but the family was just so grateful. I know the community, small community. There were probably 6 of us from Byron that were involved in that 69th Brigade call-up and service. About, I think almost every one of us was in Vietnam. So when we came home all about the same time, there was a pretty good celebration in town. Yeah, it was fun time.
That's cool. What did you think of the war protests?
Yeah, didn't like to see it. I thought they were wrong. In retrospect, I look back and I think, they had a right, but it sure didn't do build morale of the men that were in serving, and we see it today just as bad, I think. Like I said, that plane that came back carrying the body of their son, and they were castigated by the people on the flight, and when they got off the plane, that's just sad. That's not being respectful.
How do you feel about the fall of Saigon? Or how did you feel about it?
Well, it was a lot of expense and a lot of effort that I saw, and I think back to Sergeant Burns' remarks about training the ARVN, the South Vietnamese Army, how unprepared they were, and when we left, and how committed that the North Vietnamese were to taking over. I don't know. We could have probably stayed there, and it would have been a standoff for years to come, like Korea. But I suppose for the best, it was good that we got out entirely. I don't know. I don't say that it was a waste of effort, but it could have been thought better. Our congressional leadership, I really feel, needs to have a little stronger commitment themselves. If we're going to go into someplace, do it, get it done. Get the job done like they did in First World War, Second World War. They went in and did the duty. You know, as harsh as it may sound, you don't win by drawing a parallel line and sitting there. You don't win. You never win.
Were you aware of the Pentagon Papers being leaked, and how did you feel about the Pentagon Papers being leaked to the New York Times and the Washington Post?
Yeah, I remember that. Not good. That's all I'll say on that politically. It just wasn't good. I do remember that. If you can't have confidence in your military leadership of the Pentagon, then I do see it as a usage of manpower, negligence on their part that led to a lot of the continuing loss of life and struggle. And we're seeing the same thing today. There's, World War II had a motto: loose lips sink ships. And boy, that's the truest statement that ever came down the pike, in my opinion. And today we go and announce what we're going to do ahead of time. That's just nuts. Okay. If you're going to do something, for Pete's sakes, keep it quiet until it's done. Or you're putting soldiers' lives on the line. The enemy gets prepared for that. And more casualties happen because of that. So, Pentagon Papers are being leaked? Yeah.
How did you feel when the war ended?
Oh, I felt relief on it all. I didn't like the way the outcome was, and I truthfully, like I said before, I don't believe that the GI in the field lost the battle. I really don't. I think we were taking care of business. Only thing was, we were confined to those basic units, those perimetered stations, instead of going in, cleaning up the mess and making sure that it was cleaned up. We just dawdled around like a bunch of lost sheep. Protect the perimeter of your little company area, and they should not have had control of the night like they did. We should have been in control of every 24/7. That's where I think our military failed us. Leadership.
Let's see. Do you recall the day your service ended, and where were you, and how old you were?
Well, my service ended when I got back here, and I stepped off the airplane at Lincoln and got in the car for the 100-mile drive home. Felt elated, relieved, just glad to be back. we were exhausted because we hadn't had anywhere to sleep for 17 days. We just laid around. We slept on bleachers, believe it or not. That was our welcome home. Laid out on 2x10s or 2x12s and put a field jacket under your head, and that's the way we slept for the last 2.5 weeks. But so for the first three days, I was like a recluse in a cocoon. I slept and you know, it was a relaxing time.
So I guess in the days and weeks afterwards, you hung out with family, spent time with your kids.
A couple of weeks, but then I realized, hey, I've got bills to pay. I've got to have an income. So the job opening was still there in Manhattan. They had filled my place, but they were obligated to have me back, and they made room for me. It was a crowded working environment because there was not another workspace, but I went back and hung out there until several of the people that they had employed moved on to do something else, and so I went back to the standard occupation with the same workspace that I had before, and worked there for another 3.5 years until it became a time frame. I worked on commission. You got paid. There was no guaranteed salary, and for all practical comments on it, there was a time frame of about 3 months where during the summer when the college kids left Manhattan, the jobs just declined to where there wasn't hardly anything, and it got so bad that there were 5 of us in this collision repair shop, and if we heard a screech of brakes, we'd all holler in unison, "Get him!" We wanted something to work on, and it's sad, but it was true. And anyway, finally, I just said, this isn't making it. This isn't cutting, paying the bills, and we made good income down there. But finally, I went over and asked if there would be any consideration for a guaranteed minimum salary, so that we could survive. And the owner said no, they only did that for the shop foreman. And I said, that's fine, I'm looking for other work. So another friend of mine who worked there and we thought about setting up a shop together, and we went around to various communities in Iowa, Kansas, and Nebraska. And Central City, Nebraska had an appeal, and as well as 1 and 2 in Kansas down the southeast corner. But it wound up, he went back to his hometown, I went back to my own town, and we were close in that proximity, and we each opened up our own business. And I did it for 23 years in Deschler. So it was good.
Did you ever use your GI Bill?
No. Should have probably, but I had already gone through training at Milford, and so I didn't see any need to. I did think of taking some classes at Manhattan, and I did take a summer class in economics, guns and butter and all that stuff, and did pretty well in it, but I just never continued.
Did you make any close friendships while in the service?
Well, there were those that lived in the little barracks hooch that we lived in. Kid from Saddle Creek, Maryland, Steve West, and then there was another kid from Pennsylvania, and of course Gramps from Ohio. Yeah, but we never did really keep in any close contact after that. I called them all several times, and it just kind of, we had our own lives.
You said after the war, you went on and started your own business. Did your military experience influence your thinking about the war or the military in general?
Probably, as far as maintaining organization skills, I think that really helped in that respect. Keeping things clean, orderly. That really influenced me a lot. I know there was another fellow here in town who was a World War II veteran, and he had a mechanics shop, and it was remarkable. His work ethics, I guess you'd call it, were good. Everything was kind of like the toothbrush goes here and the soap dish there in the wall locker, you know. Everything had its place and everything should be clean. If there was anything that I gained from it, it was that, and in respect for the life of another human being. I gained a lot of that. Pro-life positions and things of that nature. And I think probably what, you know, they always say that, how's it said? There's no atheist in a foxhole. Those little walks to our weekly services became very meaningful. And I think I grew in faith more during that time than I would have if I hadn't been in that position in a combat zone. I began to understand what salvation, eternal salvation, spiritual life was really all about.
Did you join a veterans organization?
Yes, I did. I joined the VFW when I was in Manhattan, and basically it was the same as what you see around today. It was all World War II veterans, the old World War I guys, and you didn't see many of the young guys, but I joined with the shop foreman. He was a World War II guy at the Chevrolet Cadillac dealership, Brewer Chevrolet Cadillac. And he was an ardent member of the VFW. He had been in Europe during the Battle of the Bulge. And so he teamed up with me. He invited me, and I think he even paid my first year membership. But he was adamant that VFW was a good organization to belong to, and he's right. Basically here, I joined Deschler Legion when we moved up here, and then Hebron Legion, been a Legion member quite a while. VFW, we didn't have a VFW club. We started one in Deschler, but it didn't make it. I just didn't have enough of a grounding, I think, enough support from the state office. Was part of it. And anyway, with the Legion clubs around, which were well established, I became a Legion member. I was a post commander at Hebron for 2 years. And yeah.
What kind of activities did the post or association have? And then did you attend any reunions?
Yeah, one Vietnam veterans reunion at the VFW post there in Hebron. Happened about 4 or 5 years after we were back. Might have been 75, 70, no. Yeah, probably around 75. Yeah, 6 years later. And that was a pretty good turnout, only there were some people who were really affected mentally from it all. I found working with the Veterans Administration later, a lot of the guys who had post-traumatic stress disorder, they'd come in, and often they wouldn't come in. I'd have to go see them because I'd heard of maybe some alcoholism or maybe some family problems, disputes and things that became evident after I talked to them a while. They needed some help, and helped get them a lot of medical aid through Grand Island, Lincoln, and Omaha VA healthcare's. Post-traumatic stress disorder, a lot of them who were combat, were out in the field in the combat, and they just don't want to talk about it. You wouldn't find one of those sitting here. Very unlikely. I wasn't exposed to much of that, and so I guess I feel more of a freedom to talk, because I didn't really have any. I lost some buddies, but I didn't have firsthand experience with death in that way, and I was so grateful for that. I didn't have to pull the trigger, except at, firing ranges, targeting, practicing.
Just speaking of the aftermath of the war, what do you think we could have done differently?
Well, there were comments about the Gulf of Tonkin that maybe that wasn't all factual. Might have been a fabrication. I don't know. Wasn't there. But that was kind of what precipitated our involvement there. I think could have been fabricated. If it was tragic that it was used that way. But we were in it, and I always thought we were in it to win it until political activism began, and then I think the will of the people was lost. Our congressional delegates knuckled under, in my opinion, and didn't support us like they could have. I think that's kind of a viewpoint of a lot of Vietnam veterans. I will say that.
That they just didn't get the support.
We didn't receive, for a long time, the political will was there, but then once the activism began, a lot of them started to look after their own political skins, and when they saw the tide turning against the war, I think they all started to say, "Hey, let's don't continue this," and so they started to downsize. Yep.
What are some stories that you think are important and have gone untold?
Oh, I think just the tragic events of the loss of life of those that took part in the events, like my friend who died in Vietnam on the hill being overrun, things like that. Seldom are mentioned, and they were good people. They were there serving their country, and for some times I think maybe if we'd have had control of the area, that wouldn't have happened. Instead of being confined to small base camps and things like that, if they'd had a perimeter of the southern part of the country and just guarded the DMZ, demilitarized zone, and maintained that, but it was almost impossible with the infiltration of the enemy across other borders and things. But we never did take a front line like they did in World War I. Never. There was enemy among us. And that was just a knuckleheaded idea in my mind.
Do you think anything has changed in the last 20 to 30 years about how the war is perceived and why?
Vietnam, I think it's probably perceived now for most part, as a bad memory. A lot of Americans would rather have not been involved, and maybe that's right. I'm not going to judge that. But it's viewed as, and it was always said, well, we lost that war. Well, that's hard to hear, as a veteran who served there, that we lost the war. And I think a lot of the old timers, especially in the service organizations, when you join as a Vietnam veteran, you just somehow never measured up. They had the full support of the people. We didn't. It was obvious. The protesters and those that, politically speaking, didn't give us the full support. So I think the Vietnam generation probably was seen as a weaker set of soldiers. Not in my mind. They were some of the bravest men and women in our military ever. We just it's hard to fight the enemy and fight political activism at home. So that's how I look at it, and I have no apologies to make for that. I won't.
What lessons did you learn that you would want others to remember about this time in history?
Don't commit to something you're not going to fully commit to. Don't go in to a military engagement if you're not out to break things and kill people. That's what war is about. It's a nasty, tragic affair. But if you're not fully committed as a nation, as a people, then don't even begin the process of firing the first shot in response to something. It's a harsh thing for some people, like civilians living in Syria now. But you either help them or you stay out. And I don't think the will for Americans is there to really go in and commit to ending something anymore. Political tide has changed. Ideologies especially have changed. The organization of the didn't think I was going to get into that, but you ask. I still think that there's a political activism going on our college campuses that is detrimental to the future of America. The Saul Alinsky Rules for Radicals is alive and well on all of our college campuses, and to me it's disgusting. You either are an American with a love for your country or you're not. And if you're not, then I'd have to ask, is what's been asked recently by a lot of people, why are you here? If you don't want to support us as a people, especially the military people, that's our first obligation. As a matter of fact, Congress's total and only obligation, according to the Constitution, their only duty was to provide for the defense of the people. It wasn't to provide hand-to-mouth existence. It was only to do that one thing, to provide for the defense of the people who reside here.
Do you think there was a lot of controversy over the war?
Oh, definitely.
Why?
Because of, again, I think there was this progressive attitude among a lot of the elite, especially the Hollywood types, the Jane Fondas, who had a goal. They're on a mission. And their one mission is to do away with the democracy. That's pure and simple in my mind. That's the way I view it. I've done a lot of research on this, and you'd be surprised what you can find online. Rules for Radicals, the Cloward-Piven strategy, and you follow that online and it takes you into all of the community organizations that are going on, and it seems like the hub of that all is in two areas, basically, or was, San Francisco and Chicago. And that's where I think a lot of and now in a lot of our colleges it's spread, and I don't know if there's a solution to the issue. We're heading to a socialistic society. Democracy is holding on by just a thread yet. Didn't want to get political, but I've researched it, and from my viewpoint, at 73 years old, that's what I'm seeing.
How have your experiences shaped you as a person?
I think it made me realize the value of human life more. Love of country, love of family, spiritually. It was what do you say? A real awakening to the sanctity of life and to the vulnerability of human life, how fragile we are in a world, and holding on to what we call our freedoms. It's really, it's sad in a way how I see it going, and I think about what future generations that had the freedoms and the privileges that I had, it may not be there very much longer for them. Sometimes I think, Kath and I haven't had any grandchildren, and I think, well, maybe that was God's design. Maybe it's our blessing in the long run.
Are there any misinterpretations currently that we may have of the war?
Oh, I'm sure there still are. You've got two ideologies on it, two different viewpoints. Those that think like I do, I think it was a responsible thing to help defend the freedoms of the people of South Vietnam. And after I left, and the Viet Cong took over, and you hear the atrocities that occurred. If they had in any way supported the democracy of the government of South Vietnam, or in any way had any service towards service people from America, I really wonder about the lives and welfare of those people that we left behind. I think about the gal who was she was just a little maid or cleanup gal. She was married, she had family, and her husband was in the South Vietnamese army, and she worried about him. And I think about her, she was probably 35, 36 years old, had 3 children, and I think, wonder what happened to her, because she held a job, she was getting income from the U.S. military to provide for a little cleanup for us, little duty where she could earn a little income. And I keep thinking, there was some way that I don't even remember her name, but to have contacted that family later to see how they fared, that's been probably an ongoing concern, because they were good people. Her family was nice people. They struggled. They were rural farm family, and much the same as what you see around here, around Ehlers, Nebraska.
Once the war was over, did life return to normal, or were there some things just permanently different?
For me, I was lucky. I didn't have too much of a post-traumatic stress. I don't think I put that out of my mind. I just was more able, I guess. I guess I was blessed with a little spiritual strength, and that really helped when dealing with, like talking here, I bring up some things that, it's hard to discuss, but, it didn't affect me. Like some of the guys that I saw in my office in Hebron, Thayer County Veteran Service Office, they'd come in and, wow, they were just basket cases. And psychologically, they needed some help. I mean, these guys had seen some hard combat, and just for them, even maybe a chair hitting a wall in the other room while they were almost under my desk, it was sad. I remember one World War II family, and I'll mention this, and it has nothing to do with Vietnam, but World War II, and it was a farm family from Alexandria, and he was in an anti-tank corps in Germany, and especially highly involved in the Battle of the Bulge. And for 530 days, 37 days, I think, if my memory serves me right, they had not seen any relief. They had been in combat all that time. And he was a severe PTSD soldier. I knew another one from World War I who sat on the front porch of his brother's house in Byron, Nebraska, and blew the bugle almost 24/7. There was no way for him to make a living anymore. He had been involved in some heavy World War I on the line, trench warfare. But this guy, from Alexandria, I dealt with his family. I tried to get him, and we got him into the home. he was a farmer. He had 3 daughters and his aged wife. And we were attempting to get him into the home in Grand Island. And they held a hearing before the Board of I&R, Inquiry and Review. And they made a decision whether or not this man was going to be placed in a home. Well, I got comments, I took notes on what much the same as we sat in the office, and his daughters came from all over, Colorado, Oregon, and I think in Missouri, to try and get their father some home care through the military. And we did. Nebraska Veterans Administration gave him home care at Grand Island. But because of the fact that he had, I think within a 3-year period, they had made arrangements for the will to be distributed, that wasn't going to fly, because they saw it that he was getting rid of assets that could have taken care of him. And so we went through all of this, and I asked them to explain their childhood, their growing up period, and they said, well, whenever there was a thunderstorm rolling through, Dad would always have us get down underneath the kitchen table to make sure that we had something over our head, And neighbors that I talked with said, oh, it wasn't unusual, I'm not going to mention name, but it wasn't unusual to see him doing the low crawl up to their house while they were eating supper. He had lost it, but he dealt with that all those years and never got any help. And so I went to that Board of I&R meeting and discussed that with them, a 40-member panel, Nebraska veterans serving with the Veterans Administration. They were representatives, state commanders of the American Legion, VFW, DAV, Vietnam veterans, and others that were there. And I stood before him, I lobbied for him, told him the experiences, and his wife was sitting there, and daughters, and they were in the room too. And I had 20 minutes to give a brief on why I thought this man deserved a little bit of an excuse on this asset deal. And I went into it, and I told him, I said, I ended my conclusion remarks by saying that for someone who served the country during World War II for almost 5 years, 500 and some days of which was in the field continually, combat, I said, now to deny him a resting place in his elderly years, I said, I just think because of what you view, your rules and regulations that you've drafted, which he is inside of that, and I said, we freely admit that, but for him to be denied now would be the height of inhumaneness towards the veterans of the state. And we concluded it, and they excused us, and we went outside. And I'll never forget, there was a member of the board, and he was an attorney. And he came outside where we were standing. He called me aside, and I was new to the service organization, to the veteran service work, in about 6 months probably. And his name was Jim Chowda, and he was highly respected. I think he might be deceased now, but he called me over, and he had an attorney's office in Lincoln. He says, you ever had any formal litigation experience or any training or any schooling? And I says, no. He says, well, I think you missed the boat. He says, I'd hire you in a second. And that was probably of my career with the veterans in the first 6 months. That's probably the highlight of my 19-year career with them, because it was just fun. It was easy to do, and I must have pled a pretty good case because they put him in. They waived that, and it was a 40-0 vote to waive the rulings on the asset transfer.
That's great.
Yeah.
If you could explain the war in one word, what would it be?
Three?
I'll take 3.
Okay. A successful humanitarian effort. I think that's what In my mind, that's what it was. We won the war. I'll never, ever accept anything less of that to be said about the GIs that served there. They did an exemplary service to the people of America and to South Vietnam.
Have your views on the war changed over time?
Have I? Mm-hmm. I don't think so. I think, like I said, I grew up in a hurry, but I think I'm still basically haven't lost my values for country and God and country, and family, especially family. I think they're the most tangible thing to, of course, I'm learning more and more spiritually too, but and I told my pastor this morning when we walked out, I said, looking at life, he was comparing the struggle in life, pulling the sled. I said, as I get older, that sled's getting heavier, but that spiritual sled on the other side is getting lighter because I'm understanding and accepting more and more the tenets of our faith.
Is there anything you would like to add that we have not covered in this interview?
Well, I think we've done a good job. I don't know about you. Jordan, I got to say, couldn't have had a better interviewer.
Good.
Yeah, really. I've enjoyed being. I know it's getting late. Wow, it's already 20:03.
Yeah.
And you haven't ate, and I haven't either. But I got to say, it was a memory recollection. Some things I didn't want to even go back through, but my service personally, kind of like basic training through the end, it was hard, especially when I was married and had a child, and then I kind of did it the wrong way. Most draftees would serve their first 2 years active duty, and then they'd have that 4 years of inactive. My inactive came in the first 3.5 years till our call up, because I was really inactive besides the 6 months basic and AIT. But then I've spent my last almost full 2 years active duty, regular military. So my role was really reversed from what the ordinary was. Just exactly. I think it made it harder. I think I'd have rather, without any attachments of wife and son, it would have been easier to get my military out of the road first. I mean, the active duty part.
Did you have your second son when you were in the military as well?
Mm-mm.
No.
He came along a little later. 3.5. Yeah, 3.5. A little over 3.5 years later. Yeah. So we were living in Manhattan, and both the boys were born in Manhattan, St. Mary's Hospital, and Camille was born here. I remember exactly, you had to be on insurance for I think 6 months, and when we first got married, we was working in Byron, and I had no health care coverage. Well, when I went to Manhattan, I'd only been on like 4 months when Andy was born, and so insurance didn't cover. And it wasn't that bad at the time. I remember a couple grand. When Thane was born, I was covered under Blue Cross Blue Shield. We had a $10 deductible. That was sweet.
Yeah.
$10 deductible. I mean, you think back on that now when you see the price of deductibles today, that's just...
That's unheard of.
My share of the monthly insurance cost me, I had to pay a percentage. And I was thinking I paid half and the dealership paid the other half. And I think my share of that was something like $22 per month. That was the premium on a $10 deductible.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. Think about that.
That's crazy.
Of course, back then, cars, you could buy a brand new Chevrolet, the best of the line, the Caprice, for $3,600. Houses, my friend was in construction, and he worked for a guy, contractor, and they built new homes in Manhattan. And they built some nice ones too. They weren't, just cookie cutters. These were nice homes. 2-bedroom with an attached single stall garage was 18 grand. A 3-bedroom with a double stall garage was 26. Brand new home, Manhattan, Kansas.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it was. I was on commission. Our flat rate was $8 an hour. And if you kept up with the NAG's estimated time, which was, you had to stay busy on a commission. There was no minimum wage or no guaranteed wage, but you could easily knock down $9,000-$10,000 a year, which was way above the average back then, because you could go out and buy 3 new cars and pay for them in 1 year's time. If you wanted to. A couple years and you had a new home. So,
oh my gosh.
Yeah.
That's crazy.
But my wage scale on a commission, because we hustled and we turned out the work. It was crazy. I think back by October the 1st, usually we had paid for our year's annual requirement for Social Security. After that, they never withheld. You had paid in. I think now you have to earn, I don't know, $130,000 a year, something like that. But by October 1, most of the time I had mine already taken care of for the year. So the last 3 months were, that was a bonus pay.
Oh my gosh.
I already had that paid up. So,
wow.
Yeah. And we lived pretty good, until all of a sudden there was this drought. Nobody was wrecking a car anymore. It just wasn't coming in the door. I remember we spent hours just to entertain ourselves. We were at the shop in case something came in, and we were flipping quarters at the line just to have something to do. Everything was cleaned up, everything was spotless, but we did that. I loved Manhattan, Kansas. It was a great community.
I've heard more and more people say that.
Yeah.
That Manhattan, Kansas.
Yeah, it was really wonderful. I would have gone back there in a heartbeat, but for the fact, or stayed there, except there was no work. All of a sudden, and it was probably just an anomaly. It had to be. I'm sure that once summer was done and kids were back, plenty more crashes were coming up. But as a young guy and with a wife and child, Manhattan is a wonderful place. It was just hometown. We'd walk out on the front of the used car lot in the fall, and they would have their homecoming parade, and the bands from all over the state of Kansas would be there, marching in the parade. The Wildcat, of course, the Manhattan Wildcat band would be there. And it was wonderful. Lakes around, plenty to do. It was fun. That was probably one of the highlights of my life.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I've never been to Manhattan, but
Haven't you really?
yeah,
Oh.
I've heard.
It's
so many
changed
great
so
things.
much though from the way it was back then. In the mid 60s, it was probably around 30,000, including the college. And it was just a marvelous little community to live. School systems were great, but you got to have an income. Mm-hmm. So we found maybe opening up our own business was the way to go. Probably wasn't, but it worked. Hey, thank you, Jordan.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story, and thank you so much for your service.
Sorry to get you so late on dinner.
Oh, no, I don't. This was way better than eating food. I greatly appreciate it.
Oh, no problem. Glad to make your acquaintance a little better.
Yes.
I feel like we were good friends.
I know. I felt like I'd known you for
A long
almost
time.
forever.
Yeah. So where did you grow up?
I grew up in Minden, and
Okay.
then when my mom met Steve and my parents had gotten divorced, we moved to Axtell because Steve had kids in Axtell and he was on the school board, and my mom was like, we need to move there.
Yeah.
So we moved to Axtell, and that's where I graduated from.
Okay. Yeah.
So.
I've gone through Extell a few times. There's a little shortcut goes across there, I think, to Holdridge.
Huh?
Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, I know Minden really well because I hung out with a lot of kids from there. I know Axtell really well. Went to school there.
Well, Extell, probably what, 500 people?
769.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
A little smaller than Deshler, but not too much.
Yeah, and
I thought it was maybe a little bigger than Bruning, but it's bigger yet. Okay.
yeah, and I know Hildreth pretty well.
Yeah.
Because my dad used to live in Hildreth.
Oh yeah.
So-
There were Doug Rawls' oldest daughter lived in Hildreth.
Yes.
I don't know her.
Really weird story. So
Is this on or off?
I can turn it off.
Oh, well, we might want to put all this on there.